Hey, it's Chris, Liege Games. What are we talking about today? Clickport, Loodo Ninja. What do you need to know? One of the 3 ports coming with this crowdfunding campaign. I'm talking just about this one really briefly, give you a lowdown on my thoughts on it, as well as everything you need to know. So, what do you got going on with this? This game is relatively simple and straightforward, folks. This is pattern building matching in a slightly different way. What you've got in front of me here is basically your port connection. And based on the number of player counts, you have these different colored wires that you're just utilizing on a turn-by-turn basis to connect into one port as an action and potentially later on connect them elsewhere on the board. That's all you're doing, essentially. You are starting off with a pattern that you are randomly given at the beginning of the game that you have to achieve. Now, some of these patterns only have one shape on them. Some of them have 2. If they have 2 on them, you have to complete both of them simultaneously. The colors corresponding obviously to the cables that are present next to the board, but then the white spots being either blanks or any other cable in that formation. And you also have a little bit of a more complex version. So you have a little bit of a different spatial arrangement going on with these black back cards as well. Over along the side here, you have action cards that you're going to be able to manipulate said cables or said actions in the first place. You have your greens, your yellows, and your reds. You put out one of those every game, and they each cost you, as you can see, 1, 2, or 3 action points. And that's what these little cubes represent. These cubes are given to you at the beginning of the game in order to pay for the cost of those cards. If you have enough, you can do it. If you don't, well, you can't. And you just go on your turn and you either do one of 3 things. You plug in 1 cable into 1 spot. You unplug 2 cables from anywhere on the board, or you do one of those actions. That's the game in a nutshell. It plays anywhere from 2 to 6 different people. And that main difference is going to be how many of each color cable are going to be allowed in the game in the first place. So these cards on the side, as I mentioned, right here, for example, unplug all partially connected cables from the server. So, oh, this one only has 1 in, you're gone. For example, chill out room, unplug the plug from the server along with all neighboring plugs, then plug in any one you want. So they're basically just allowing you to manipulate it in any way, shape, or form. As you can also see on the board here, there is a halfway divided line. If 2 players are playing, you only use half of the board. If any more than that, you use the full spaces. So what are my thoughts on it? Pros and cons. Pros, well, that's the game in a nutshell, right? Super easy to learn, super easy to play. It's just a spatial manipulation of how you can rearrange these colors. At the lower player counts, it's really, really fast. I'd make the argument that it's almost too fast. Pro, I mean, the aesthetic with the cables, it's a nice dexterity feel. The con with this also at the 2 player count, 2 players is not going to be as fun. 2 players, when we played it, I mean, it's essentially, I have mine, you have yours, you have pretty much the exact same numbers for the most part of things that you're going to need to put down next to each other. And so it can end very, very quickly, especially if people aren't utilizing their abilities along the side to take that. And that's the other pro and con that goes with this, right? Almost all of these cards in some way, shape, or form are going to be a little bit of indirect take that, because you're not actively affecting the other person, but what you're doing is you're messing up with their plugs. And so you can almost have simultaneous solitaire going on here with you doing your pattern over here and them doing their pattern over here. But eventually you might just want to utilize your turn to screw up their one that they just did that they clearly need. And so how do you like that in a game? Because sometimes that's a big divisive element for people. And if you don't want to have that, well, the 2 player count has a lot more of it. The higher player counts, you're going to be less concerned about that directly. The higher player counts, given the limited number of cables, is actually going to be a little bit better from that aspect, because you're going to have to move them, not because you're trying to screw somebody else, but because there just isn't enough available otherwise for you to manipulate, or you're going to have to manipulate more significantly than just plugging or unplugging. You're going to have to use something that allows you to manipulate it in a different way, like removing it and then plugging it into the exact same place as the previous one was, but just of a different color. So you're going to have to use these powers in order to give you the advantage. The other thing that's nice, well, I mean, there are 4 different powers of each color, but you're kind of stuck with one for each game. The blessing curse of that is you know what one is out there, but the curse of it is that it's just the one out there. So if it's not the one you need, or you over judiciously spend on some of the higher ones and can't pay for them later when they might be more necessary for your turns, you can easily overshoot your, well, supply of how many you have, because there is no way to replenish these action cubes in the first place. So it's very tight in that sense of choosing when you want to use these powers and when you're just going to be having to unplug and plug in the first place normally. All in all, it's a straightforward pattern building game with a different aesthetic using this as opposed to tiles. Did it need to be this? No, not really. It's just a nice aesthetic feature that, you know, goes with the actual aesthetic of the game in the first place, that lines up with the other 2 port games that Loodo Ninja's putting out in the same campaign. Wasn't blown away with it. Not really a whole lot of other issues though with it at the same time. So that's Clickport.